Your success in life will be determined largely by your ability to speak, your ability to write, and the quality of your ideas, in that order.
The sentence you just heard was from Professor Patrick Winston's talk on how to speak. He was professor for AI and machine learning at MIT, and for over 40 years equipped MIT students with one of the most important tools in life: the ability to communicate complex ideas. His book Make It Clear inspired this video, and after watching it, you will have learned powerful tools to become a good communicator. I've summarized 7 tips on getting better at communicating, and I hope to help you in your career and maybe even life as well. Hi, I'm Leo, and in my job as an engineer and manager, one of my biggest responsibilities is to support the engineers I'm working with in their career. And one of the most common questions is, how do I get that promotion? How do I become a senior engineer? And since a lot of software engineers do the same mistake I did in the beginning of my career, my answer is often the same. You need to get better at communicating. When I started coding, I was absolutely fascinated by learning another programming language or a framework or a pattern or trick that made it easier to solve a certain problem. I learned a lot from documentation, articles, YouTube videos. But even when I got more experience and I started to join communities, I only searched for very specific communities and meetups. For example, about Angular or React or TypeScript or something like machine learning. But in order to have a significant impact on a larger solution to a problem, you need to collaborate with other software engineers and other people. And throughout my career, I encountered that more and more and got the feeling that there must be a more fundamental tool than just knowing how to code. I realized that it's not enough that I know how something works or how I can solve something. I need to be able to convince others to work with me in the same direction or negotiate in certain situations. And at that moment, it clicked for me. It is all about communication. In all parts of trying to find a solution to a problem, you are communicating to understand the problem, you are collaborating with others, you are removing conflict with other people, and maybe even asking other people for help to help you to solve the problem. And it's exactly communication that will bring you from the level of a good engineer to a level where you can have a tremendous impact on the product you're working on or on the teams you're working with. So what I've observed in my career and working with other software engineers, it's often the ability to communicate that keeps us from getting that promotion or getting the job we really want to have. In general, not knowing how to communicate will limit the level of impact you can have on so many dimensions in life. It will not only boost your productivity or reduce the amount of conflicts you will have, it will also generally help you to get what you want. Okay, I hope I could convince you to go with me through my 7 tips on how to get better at communicating. And the first one is, you always have to know who you're speaking to. Who is your audience? This is incredibly important because depending on who you're speaking to, you need to change how you deliver a message. If you're speaking to product managers or engineers or your managers or even customers, it all changes how you will deliver the message to them. You not only need to adjust the words you're using, but also the type of information you're conveying. A product manager is much more interested in maybe the delivery and where the project is going, or if you encountered any blockers. Whereas an engineer is much more interested in the specific details on the blocker you have. So the technical detail and maybe how they can help you in a technical solution. If you're speaking to a group of people, you need to be careful that you're not excluding people when communicating to them. So if you're speaking to a group of engineers, but there's also a product manager or designer in the meeting, you need to be careful that you don't use so complex language and so technical language that they feel excluded for half an hour of a meeting. Or another example could be when there's a junior engineer, you should always try to include them and explain things in a way that they can also understand them and involve them in the conversation. So your audience really matters, and you should always keep in mind or ask yourself before, who am I speaking to? Who am I delivering that information to? And the second thing I want to speak about is, are the right people involved? Are you speaking to the right people? It's kind of obvious, but you should never invite the wrong people to a meeting. And this sounds so obvious that I almost didn't want to include it in the video, but I've seen it more and more times that people just invite a group of people and half of the people don't even know why they are there and don't even contribute to a meeting or to a conversation. So only try to speak to the people that are actually necessary. It's really about not wasting anyone's time and showing respect to other people's time, and this is also an incredibly important part of communication, of being a good communicator. And the third thing I want to speak about is focus on the problem. What is the problem you want to solve? Or what is the decision you want to make? What is the goal of this meeting or this conversation? If you're not really clear what the problem is or the decision you want to take, nothing else matters. This is really the first thing you need to start with. What is the problem? Can I define the problem clearly and easy to understand for others? And do I know what kind of decision I want to take? And another important thing is that you always focus on the impact. What impact will the solution to this problem have? What are we actually solving? What are we achieving here? And what I've done in a lot of meetings is that I use the first 5 minutes of the meeting to really clarify what is the problem, what is the decision we are going to take, and what is the value we are creating with whatever we're doing in this meeting. And before I continue with point number 4, if you found this interesting so far, subscribe to my channel. I'm planning to create more videos on software engineering topics, software engineering careers, and in general, things I've learned throughout my career. With your subscription, you also help me to get closer to my goal of putting YouTuber in my CV. Okay, let's continue with the 4th tip. Simplicity is the most important thing. Every time you speak to someone, you should always try to not overwhelm them with details. You have to think about that they are not in the context. Maybe they didn't even work with the technology you're talking about. So it's always important that you condense everything you try to say to the bare minimum, to the simplest form you can convey information. And if you listen to good speakers, to people who are incredibly good at giving speeches, they usually speak in very simple words and always have a great structure to follow them along through this complex idea. So one thing I always recommend is to structure your thoughts. Before you go in a meeting or before you go to give a talk, really have a clear structure ready on what you want to talk about. The problem definition or value proposition, the maybe 3 things you want to talk about, or as you see in this video, there's 7 things you want to talk about, and then go step by step and remind people where they are. Remind people that we just talked about something and then go to the next one. That makes it much easier for people to follow you and not lose you somewhere in the complex information you're presenting. Another great idea is to use analogies. With analogies, you're using knowledge the people already have to explain what you want to explain. So you can highlight similarities, or you can say, this is almost like something else you already know. For example, if you're trying to explain something more complex like a car engine and you want to talk about the timing belt and how it works, you could use the analogy of a bicycle, because that is something more people are familiar with. And if you talk about the bike chain, maybe they understand better how the car engine works. But you can also distinguish your ideas from other ideas. Winston gives the idea of an arc. This is also an arc. This is not an arc, and this is also not an arc, distinguishing it from real arcs. And obviously, one thing we engineers do a lot is to illustrate our ideas. We draw flowcharts or sequence diagrams or architectural diagrams of the systems we're working at. This is one really good way to illustrate what you're talking about, so that people who are listening have a mental model, a visual model of what you're talking about. That makes it much simpler to follow your thoughts. And the 5th thing I want to talk about is active listening. This is something you find immediately if you Google how to communicate, how to get better at communication. You will find countless articles on active communication. But I quickly want to talk about what that means for us software engineers and why it is so important. Active listening starts with giving the speaker your full and undivided attention. So you really sit with someone and be present, be aware, listen to what they're speaking about. Practicing active communication means staying with the speaker and following them along what they want to say. If we take this example where 2 people are speaking and there's a misunderstanding, you might move in different directions and lose each other. If you then, at another point, assume something wrong, you are completely lost and don't understand each other at all, resulting in very bad communication. If you listen actively, on the other hand, it would go differently. In the moment where you don't understand the speaker fully, you ask a clarifying question and can follow along. This also means that if you ask a follow-up question, the speaker can say, No, this is not what I've meant, further taking you along their story. And you can stay close and understand each other. And you've probably experienced that sometimes people are in meetings or in conversations that are incredibly present, and it seems like everything you say to them, they really understand, and if not, they ask follow-up questions and deeply understand what you mean, and you leave a conversation with this feeling of, wow, they got what I tried to say. They probably were using active listening techniques. To become better at active listening, one of the first things you need to do is to remove possible distractions, because the active listening is really important, because if someone is distracted, they are not really focused and it's really difficult to follow what they say, and Sometimes you don't even know. My point is, if you're distracted, you cannot listen at all. And it makes it really hard to communicate. So one of the first things I always recommend is reduce distractions to a minimum. Turn off notifications, remove your phone, turn everything on silent and actively listen. Then, once you're really present and listening to the speaker, one really powerful technique is to rephrase what they just said. You've probably noticed that some people are really good at bouncing back to you what you just said. So they're saying something like, okay, let me quickly repeat to you what I just heard. And then they repeat step by step what they heard. And often it is not exactly what you said. That then gives you the opportunity to interrupt the speaker and say like, no, this is not what I meant. Further defining your idea and distinguishing it from other things they might have understood. Keep in mind, everyone has a very different context and very different knowledge, and a lot of times we hear things differently than they are said. And rephrasing something back to the speaker is one of the most powerful techniques to truly understand what they wanted to say. And the sixth thing I want to mention is show humility. Being humble and not arrogant during a conversation removes a lot of barriers and allows other people to open up and maybe to be a bit more vulnerable while talking to you, which also will give you more information. And one of the most powerful sentences I have found is when I join a meeting as a senior engineer trying to figure out an architectural solution, or now as an engineering manager to help to solve a problem, to say a sentence like, I also don't know the answer. Let's try to find a solution together. Let's learn together. That shows that you are curious, open, and that you can also be wrong. This is incredibly important to give other people the feeling that they can speak openly and that they can also be wrong. They also don't know, and in a lot of technical, complex situations, no one in the meeting really knows the solution. So it is incredibly important to set that as a basis so that everyone can open up and you can find a solution much quicker. But in my case, this sentence also reduces your own stress. A lot of times you have the feeling that you are supposed to know. You are hired as a senior engineer and everyone expects you to know the answer, but this is not the case. And entering a meeting with such a sentence with humility reduces your stress and anxiety in such a meetings, and you can jokingly say, I know nothing about this, let's learn it together. And that speeds up the learning process incredibly. It kind of puts your guards down. It makes you less defensive and more open to learn and to change your opinion when you're faced with different information. And this speed of learning is incredibly important to accelerate your career and the impact you can have on the problem you're working on. And the last thing I want to speak about is the conclusion. You have to conclude every conversation or meeting you're in. And this is what you can usually observe in people that are really good at facilitation. They can facilitate a decision because at some point they will take a look at the time and they will say, hey, we talked about all those different kinds of solutions. Let's come to a conclusion and let's write down some action items. This is really important because when you have a long meeting and you go out of the meeting and don't really know what happens now, it feels not really effective and it doesn't feel like you can act on the decisions you have just discussed. And what I said in that already is that you always should be time conscious. In the beginning, to take a bit of time to talk about the value proposition and what you actually want to talk about, the problem you're trying to solve. Then having the open discussion in the conversation, and then at the end to take a few minutes to conclude everything and write down some action points. Okay, that was the 7 tips I wanted to give you about how to get better at communicating. But I've promised you one bonus point in the beginning, which is humor. It is a bit counterintuitive, but I think humor is incredibly important to work productively. Humor is a great tool to use in long meetings or long conversations where everything gets a bit serious and stiff. It loosens up the situation, but also brings back attention. Everyone is already getting a bit tired and maybe the technical details you're talking about get a bit monotonous, and a joke here and there makes it much easier to listen and to follow through a long conversation. But humor also helps us to reduce stress. When we laugh, we usually relax and we are more open to new ideas or maybe different opinions. So a joke somewhere here and there is incredibly important to run a good meeting. And as Andrew Tarvin said in his incredibly good TEDx talk on humor at work, humor is different from comedy. It's not about making work funny, it's about making work more fun.
I was sitting in another bar, this time in Austin, Texas, with a colleague of mine named Doug Lennott. And Doug's a fantastic speaker. And so I said to Doug, you're a fantastic speaker. What's your secret? And he said, oh, I always finish with a joke, and that way people think they've had fun the whole time.